what are the differences between internal and external auditing, fraud examination, and forensic accounting? Are there any similarities and points of intersection among these three fields? This is what we'll be considering in this class. Internal auditing and external auditing. What are even the difference between these two? Let me just put it in simple language. An internal auditor is the employee of an organization who is saddled with the responsibility of ensuring that the internal control measures within the organizations are followed. Things like approval limits, things like the different separations of power in terms, especially as it relates to the finances of the company. They look into the books of the company. An external auditor, on the other hand, is not an employee of the organization. Is an external auditor, just like the way it sounds. They come from outside from time to time to audit the books of the company for irregularities and to ensure compliance. Auditing anywhere involves processes and steps in planning of the audits, conducting risk assessments, identifying and testing internal control, reporting audit finding. This is the last point of an auditor's work. He reports his findings. So his reports may now be suggestive of fraud or not. That is, in his reports, it might be that he has discovered symptoms that are suggestive that there is a fraud somewhere. But his works ends there. It doesn't have the work of a fraud examination, of a fraud examiner. That is, he stops at reporting that, okay, these are my findings. These are my findings. These are what we've seen. And these things are signals and symptoms that they are frauds, that something is going on here and here that needs and necessitates examination. In some cases, the external auditing firms as well carry out functions and services of fraud examination. So from there, we proceed to fraud examination. When there are suggestive symptoms of fraud, as stated in the report of the auditor, then a fraud examiner is now invited. Who is a fraud examiner? A fraud examiner uses techniques to divine who, what, where, and when and how of the fraud. That is, he examines and detects through techniques. He defines who carried out the fraud, what the fraud is all about, where the fraud was carried out, when the fraud was carried out, and how the fraud was carried out. These are what? These are the functions of a fraud examiner. And mind you, the functions of a fraud examiner does not does not stop there. It goes as far as looking at preventive way, deterrence way, and detection. It looks at how can we prevent it. What are the prevention mechanisms we can put in place to checkmate such frauds? What are the preventions? The prevention. How can we put in place prevention mechanisms so that in future we won't have the same reoccurrence of the same scenario? Then what are the deterrents? That is, the things that will serve as deterrents for who may in future want to engage in the same type of acts. Then the detection itself. How do we detect it? The investigation and remediation. When we talk about remediation, addressing the internal control issues, including helping the victim, maybe the organization in this instance, to file insurance claim when appropriate, and even testifying in court. That is where fraud investigation intersects with forensic accounting. You can see how we are placing the scenario now. If there are symptoms suggestive of fraud after the audit is carried out, then audit intersects with fraud examination. If there are none, the audit ends there. It has nothing to do with fraud examination. But when and when only there are symptoms suggestive that there is a fraud that has been perpetrated, and there is need to define who perpetrated it, what the fraud is all about, and what the figure is all about, when it was done, and how, then a fraud examiner is invited to put in, not only to do all this, but to put in what? The preventive mechanism, the deterrence, the detection, and investigate properly and put in place a remediation plan. That is, how do we help the victim, which is the organization in this scenario, to what? To get to be restored. How do we put necessary internal control? How do we remedy this? This mess, how do we clean it? Remediation is talking about cleaning up the mess from A to Z. So now, in fact, it's now gets to the level of when we want to get remediation, when we want to ensure that the perpetrator is punished or is made liable to restore, then we need to, a fraud examiner will not go and put gun on the neck of the perpetrator. That means that issue is going to court. And when it's going to court, we are definitely talking about forensic accounting. That is where fraud examination, That is where fraud examination intersects with forensic accounting. But mind you, fraud examination may or may not lead to court. Maybe at the time they came in. This is at the audit level, is just a symptom we saw. It's like a smell, you are perceiving it. You've seen the handwriting on the wall. Now the fraud examiner has been invited. He may at the end of the day not see a typical fraud, but maybe there's a loophole that, okay, if we allow this loophole to continue, there will, at the end of the day, be a fraud. So he puts in place a prevention mechanism, and his work ends there. But if there's an actual fraud, he puts in place, there will be a deterrence, that is an internal control measure that is put in place to deter others that, okay, this is the punitive measure, this is the limit, this is where a line you don't cross. Then the detection itself, the investigation, the remediation, that is restoring the victim, witnessing in court. That is where we are talking about the fraud examination has now led to the court, and it has intersected properly with forensic accountants. A forensic accounting. Who is a forensic accountant? A forensic accountant takes fraud, fraud evidences and witness in the court. That is, if the issue has resulted into litigation already, a forensic accountant is the one that will take the evidences and witness in the court. So the forensic accounting involves witnessing. It sheds light. These people are not professionals. You as an accountant, the judges and all that, you share the light that this is what we are talking about. You will see in movies sometimes when the forensic accountant is witnessing, they can use a slide. And mind you, it's not only in accounting that we have forensics. We have medical forensics. That is a medical person that is shedding light in the law court, witnessing, giving expert opinion as it relates to his field. So in an accountant, if it's a chemistry expert that is giving, that is forensic chemistry. That is, maybe somebody poisoned somebody. Now we want to look at the chemical composition and the reason why it is that chemical that killed that person. So it sheds light. The same thing will appear to an accountant. Maybe the financial statement, you shed light that these people actually cook their books. You witness, you beat it down into small layman language that the judges can and the jury can relate with and can inform their decision. You share the light, you give your expert opinion that if this and this is done, this is the implication. With these things that this perpetrator has done, perpetrator of fraud, these are in my own opinion as an expert, these are the implications? You provide verifiable evidence. Maybe there is a money laundering somewhere, the money they've carted, maybe it's a government or a fraud under a government institution. Maybe you even trace the money. Where did the money go? What are the cycles of this money laundering? How did they launder the money? These are verifiable evidence. You will see in some cases, especially in a country like Nigeria, where a court will throw away the suit filed by EFCC for lack of evidence, because the forensic aspect of it has not been has not been properly treated. It's not like there was no fraud, but the judge is saying, with all the gibberish you've put in place in my front, I'm not satisfied. So forensic accounting is the point of intersection now between accounting and law. You can see how these things intersect with each other. Audit, when there is symptoms suggestive of fraud, intersects with fraud examination. Fraud examination, where the case now leads to courts. Now, when the fraud has been determined there was fraud and we want remediation, then it has intersected with forensic accounting. And essentially, forensic accounting is just the point of intersection of accounting and law. That's why I said in a previous slide, in a previous class, that you can't divorce fraud from law, because the end point of it is law. An accountant can sentence somebody to jail time by himself, and can force somebody to repay what he has looted by hanging him or putting gun at his neck. It has to take its recourse to the law. So in this class, we've been able to look at the point of intersection, the similarities, and the differences between the three fields: internal and external audit. I will just name them as audit, fraud examination, and forensic accounting. And mind you, these are different and independent careers that an accountant can take up, and even a non-accountant, if you are ready to what? To take it up as a career. And I must tell you, this is one of the careers that people should be looking at, go into, especially in a place like Nigeria, Africa, and even world over.